Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
On today's podcast, we're going to try to unpack the idea of narcissism. What are the different kinds of narcissism, and how can we relate to it in ourselves?
And I think try to approach narcissism from a broad, multi-leveled approach to look at the myth. When is narcissism healthy or unhealthy? Some narcissists can be very dependent and people-pleasing. Others can be very dominating. But it's a very broad and rich category of phenomena of the human psyche.
Yes.
So let's start, as we often do, with a myth or a fairy tale, because that connects us to the archetypal deep tap root of whatever it is we're talking about. So there is a myth, the Myth of Narcissus, a couple of different versions.
So we'll talk about the Roman myth of Narcissus. And it starts out that Narcissus' parents were worried by the extraordinary beauty of their child. And so they go and visit the prophet Tiresias to consult about the child's future. Tiresias tells them that the boy would grow old only if he did not get to know himself. When Narcissus was a young man, around 16, he was walking in the woods, and the nymph Echo saw him and fell madly in love with him, was following him, and when Narcissus sensed that someone was near him and called out, "Who's there?" Echo would simply respond, "Who's there?" And this went on for some time until Echo decided to show herself. She attempted to embrace the boy, who rebuffed her and pulled away and ordered her to leave. Echo was left heartbroken and spent the rest of her life in glens until nothing but the echo of her voice remained. Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, hearing the story, decided to punish Narcissus. And as Narcissus was walking through a wooded area, he happened upon a still pond, and in leaning over, caught a glimpse of his own face, which he found to be so beautiful that he fell in love and could not be separated from this image. He pined away and eventually became the flower of the narcissus, which we know as a kind of daffodil, which is often found in near the water, inclining over the edge of the water as if to see its own reflection.
So what we have here is a very beautiful child.
Yes.
And I know clinically that is often one of the seeds of narcissism, is the child that is especially pleasing and performs. It's as if there's a spotlight on the child, and the child learns to stay in the spotlight and be very pleasing to the parents and get attention for performing.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to sort of start off talking about how narcissism can be healthy, and certainly it can be healthy in adults. But Deb, part of what you're touching into is that it is a normal part of a certain stage of childhood.
There is a sense of healthy narcissism, and I think about my youngest grandchild who learned to do a somersault and came over and said, "You want to see me do a somersault?" And of course I said, "Wow, yes, absolutely." And then she did one, and then she said, "You want to see me do it again?" Very, very pleased with herself and her ability to perform.
So the psychoanalytic theorist Heinz Kohut called this primary narcissism. Mm-hmm. And I think it goes up until about age 8, I want to say. And it's true when my kids were that age, and I would drive them around with their friends, and it was just it was a little hard to listen to because the kids would just all sit and boast. Well, I'm a really good artist. Or, the other kid would say, well, I'm really, really good at this video game. I've got the highest score, of all my friends or something. And it would just they would just go back and forth, sort of trading, like, well, I won a chess tournament and I have $50 in my bank account. And it was very, it's sort of like, kind of like fingernails on a chalkboard in a way to hear kids do that, but it's normal. And like your granddaughter, she needs to kind of be the apple of everyone's eye. That's an important experience to have developmentally.
Yes, there's a way in which throughout childhood, we are building an image of ourselves in the psyche. And when that image is particularly enhanced, or we have a positive regard of it, and the people in our environment have a positive regard of it, it gives us the strength and later in life, a certain kind of creative audacity so that we can move forward and take risks and to put ourselves out into the world in challenging ways.
I have a hunch. I'm looking at what the underbelly of this might be. And that for your kids in the car, Lisa, or for my granddaughter, their ability to claim that for themselves. I won the chess tournament. I can do a somersault. Versus the child that is a narcissistic extension of the parent and exists in the spotlight that the parent shines on him or her of what the parent needs. And so the child can kind of grow up living the unlived life of the parent and learning that his or her only value is the ability to dance or sing or
do whatever it is the parent would sort of make a big fuss over.
And that's a very different kind of beginning of an early sense of what it means to be a self, whether you have to exist for someone else to gratify other people, or whether you can claim your own competence.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I can think of a client who was forced to take up ballet as a child because the mother always wanted to dance ballet and was raised in a poor environment, and they couldn't have ballet lessons, but they were darn sure that the daughter was not only going to do it, but excel at it and do it for many, many years. It took a long time for her to separate herself out from gratifying her mother in that way.
It's so being a narcissistic extension of the parent. Yeah.
So what we're pointing to is that when narcissism is not healthy, that there often is a problem between the child and the primary caregivers that lays down the seeds of what could become a narcissistic problem later on in life. And in the myth, we see that the parents of narcissists are troubled by their child. Now, in the myth, there's something about his extraordinary beauty bothers them, so that they have to consult.
Them. Yeah.
It worries them.
The myth and I know we're trying to stick to healthy narcissism here, and I'm going to sort of get out of order a bit. But since we're talking about the sort of developmental aspects of narcissism and sort of how it can have its roots in childhood, first of all, I think that if you do become a narcissistic extension of your parent, you have sort of the opposite problem. You have trouble claiming your own healthy narcissism as an adult. I think that's what that can look like. It's like you still are not, it's not clear if you have to be sort of in service to other people. But there's some research that came out a couple of years ago that I thought was really interesting. It was these researchers looked at something that they called parental overvaluation. And there's even a little self-test you can take, the parental overvaluation scale, which of course I immediately went and did. But it's sort of like, some of the questions like, do you think your child is special? Do you think your child is entitled to special treatment? And they did find that parents who scored high on that tended to have kids who showed narcissistic traits. And this makes a lot of sense. If you're given the message by your parents that you're special and you get to play by a different set of rules, that breeds something that looks like narcissism.
I'm thinking that maybe the essential dividing line here is between what the child himself or herself wants to do and can claim for himself, and what is imposed on him or her by parents, so that the child does not develop an inner core or an inner sense of this is me. The me has been defined by caregivers, parents, whoever is forming that child's personality, so that sense of self is external. It's whoever applauds me, whoever pats me on the head, whoever gives me blue ribbons. And that's how I define myself. So it's out there rather than in here.
But it's both, as we extend that a little bit, because as the environment rewards the child only for what pleases the parents or only for what pleases the school teacher, that is internalized. And one of the terms is the false self.
Yes.
That, yes, the child is looking out to be a pleasing narcissistic extension, but they become identified with the false self, which then resides in them and continues to inform what they should be or think they should be pursuing, which continues to alienate themselves from their true selves.
Right. And I think that, one of the things when you have a false self and you're constantly looking outside you for validation, whether it's because you had a parent who needed you to be a ballerina, or you had a parent who said, oh, honey, you're so special, and this is kind of taking us back to the myth. I mean, in my imagination, Narcissus's parents overvalued him. They were like, oh, well, we need to go talk to Tiresias and find out if he's going to be okay, when really they should just said, get out there in the fields and help us,
pick the fruit off the
pick
trees.
Bananas or whatever it is, whatever they did back then. But it's this idea that when you have that sort of narcissistic false sense of self, it is fragile. There is a fragility that comes with that. And I think that that's right there in the myth too. It's that, they're worried about him. It's sort of, we have to make sure he's going to be okay. So what about in adulthood? We sort of said, well, yeah, it's normal for kids to have this sort of primary narcissism. Is there such a thing? Can narcissism ever be healthy in adulthood?
Well, I think that we were touching on that a little bit, that if a child has a sense of being entitled to some quantity of self-development and self-gratification, that later on in life, they can find that shows up as what I had said, a kind of audacious creativity, that they can insist that the world makes space for their creative endeavors.
Oh, I really like that. Or even that the world makes space for them, even if it's not necessarily creative, but just in any way, sort of like sometimes we have to muscle our way into things.
Well, I'm thinking we're maybe confusing narcissism with simply assertiveness and a healthy sense of of ego. Sometimes I put other people first, and sometimes it's my turn, a self-declared sense of my turn, my space, my wishes override those of whoever else I might be with. And that is not really, I don't think that is narcissism.
Well, I think it depends on how you define the terms. I mean, I have heard others write about healthy narcissism, and I think we could either say anything that isn't well related to the other is narcissism. And if there's a sense of relationality, like, yes, sometimes you go first, but sometimes I go first, that's relational, right? We say, well, that's not really narcissism then, because by definition, the two things exclude each other. But I think it depends on, it sort of depends on where you want to draw that line. I kind of like the idea of healthy narcissism, but that's just me.
I'm relating it really to empathy, and whether or not it's kind of an automatic reaction that I'm doing this or I'm taking this, versus I've thought about it, I'm relating to you. Instead of it being your turn, I really think it's my turn. That's much more empathic and related and conscious of, I think it's my turn, versus unconscious, which is more maybe related to narcissism of just, I want it, I'm doing it, I'm taking it.
Well, we can say that, yes, that's unconscious, but the feeling in the narcissist that they are only able to identify their own hunger, or only able to identify what's needed to maintain the scaffolding of the false self as the primary drive, that is actually a highly targeted need. It's not a general category of unconsciousness, is that the movements and the behaviors of the narcissist are highly specific, and they're highly driven. They're not simply unconscious, I think. So, and if we return to the myth, we also see that Narcissus at 16 is walking through the woods and there's a girl next to him and he is unable to see her. She's invisible to him. And even though she's kind of crying out and trying to make a connection, he is not able to see her. And then when she's finally able to be seen and then expresses her emotional experience because it doesn't serve him in some fashion, he doesn't relate to it, causing this wound in this woman and silencing her. If we think about that, the false self and the inability to feel integrated enough to tolerate imagining even the experience of another person, that's very purposive in a way, what the narcissist is doing in terms of choosing to continue to prop themselves up as the primary goal.
Well, you're
It's
saying purposive,
but not very conscious.
Yeah, you're saying purposive, but they're one school of thought about this is this is characterological, this is structural, this
Yes.
is just how some
Right.
people kind of get built, probably by some combination of biology and nature and nurture.
And in the myth, I think it's really a perfect illustration of narcissism, that what the person is echo. And so he does not hear her. All he hears is himself.
Yes.
He can't, and it's a profound lack of ability to relate to an other, a
Yes.
profound lack of empathy.
Kohut, who of course wrote a lot about narcissism, he says this is a mirroring problem, and of
Yes.
course Narcissus finds the pool which mirrors him, but he has Echo, who also auditorily mirrors him, because that's all an echo is. So it's like you can never see an other because you're always trying to find yourself reflected back.
So say a little bit more about who is Kohut for our listeners. Heinz Kohut.
Heinz Kohut was a theorist, fairly recent vintage, I think. And he is the founder of a school of psychology known as self-psychology. And he dealt a lot with narcissism. So Kohut actually talked a lot about mirroring and how adequate mirroring could help the narcissist heal. And what we mean by mirroring is sort of exactly what it sounds like, kind of letting the other person know that we see them.
Especially at a feeling level. So with little kids, like when my granddaughter said, "You want to see me do a somersault?" I mirror her by saying, "Wow, a somersault, really?" That the feeling is reflected back to the child of her excitement, or, a child that has scraped his knee of, "Oh my goodness, that must really hurt. Well, let's take care of it. Let's wash it off very carefully." Reflecting back and mirroring the feelings more than the verbal content.
Because it's sort of like, right, it's not an echo, it's something more integrative. And it's true that like we come to know ourselves in relationship to others. And because they help us see ourselves and understand our experience, it's even more sort of knitted together even than I'm saying it. But I remember when my daughter was little, and she was slamming the door to the cabinet as she took out a toy or tried to put it away or something. And she was, I could tell she was really angry, and I think she couldn't get the door to latch or something. And I said, "You look frustrated." And she said, I'm frustrated. But, it was like, I don't think she had that word.
Yes.
But it was helpful to her to have me language her experience. So that's a sort of example of mirroring.
Yes. And that for children, they're having enormous experiences that are unnamed and are unrecognized, and linking the ego to the experience is part of what inoculates a child from developing a narcissistic personality. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that becomes part of the healing process in therapy.
Yes, right.
Isn't that a lot of what we do, is give people words and language so that felt experiences can be brought into consciousness and given
related to.
Exactly.
So I think maybe what we're saying is in narcissism, there's just a lot that can't be related to.
Yes.
And then becomes defended against because its integration is not congruent with the false self.
Right. And so there again is this idea about fragility.
Right. And internal defensiveness.
So let's look at some ways that narcissism can be unhealthy. So sometimes people talk about different kinds of narcissism. Joseph, you were mentioning before dependent narcissism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's some language around categorizing narcissism as a way of kind of understanding it a little bit more deeply. So the dependent narcissist can still require a tremendous amount from the people around them in terms of bolstering them up, keeping their false self-image afloat, but they'll tend to do that by being a highly pleasing and perhaps even pandering style of personality. So they may actually offer a lot of compliments. They may be very attuned to what makes the other person pleased. And there may even be a feeling that there's a relationship happening. But when we look at the dependent personality, that there's very little self-understanding. There's often a tremendous poverty of empathy and very little interest in the inner lives of other people, although they can be deeply pleasant, these kinds of personality types, because they can be very charming. So we link this sometimes with the idea of the puer, and I think what was made very famous in the 50s was the Peter Pan complex.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that the kind of Peter Pan type person, which would in Jungian terms we might call the puer, that would be an example of a narcissist.
Of a dependent narcissist.
Okay.
And what happens in Peter Pan? He stays in Never Never Land and Wendy leaves.
Yes. That he'd like Wendy to join him there, to take a caregiving role, to be this Wendy lady, be a mother figure for him. But he doesn't really want to be troubled. He doesn't want to grow up. He doesn't want to be inconvenienced by the vicissitudes of life.
And eventually, he wants Wendy to do it his way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And Wendy has to leave and grow up herself, return to her own world of normal development and shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Pan has no shadow. And that is often true of the narcissist.
Right.
You're a dependent narcissist. Pleasing, even pandering, pleasant. Everything seems like it's all really very, 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 very nice. And then eventually people pull away. People get irritated. People might not be able to put their finger on what it is, but they just start to go in a different direction.
Yeah, you were saying that person could be pleasing, and I, it caught me for a second because I get what you're saying, that oftentimes these people are very charming, and maybe a lot of people like them, and they even have a lot of friends. But I think, Deb, you're also picking up on over time, like there's just something that you're like, I don't, I'm supposed to see so and so today. Oh no, I really wish I had made different plans.
Something that is not authentic because a false self is not authentic.
And eventually it's hard to be around someone with a false self.
Yes.
So I'm thinking about maybe a different way that rather than sort of the Peter Pan way, it might be someone who maybe seems very sweet, but is kind of needy. And sort of like the tyranny of the weak, like the person is kind of very, very sweet and always very lovely, and everything's just as it is. But the person manages to
suck all the air out of the room.
and manages to kind of require a lot of care and tending. And might that be a way that narcissism can kind of present?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's when you notice that it's all about that person, however it's presented, whether it's presented in a more sort of alpha narcissist way or the tyranny of the weak or as a dependent person. I think the bottom line is that it has to be that person's way. You notice over time that it's all about that other person, and real empathy, real concern, just real interest is not there for the other.
And for the dependent narcissist, real interest, real concern, and getting deeply involved is boring. It's not exciting enough.
Yeah.
And they have a tendency, actually, I think often dependent narcissists will lose interest and find another object before people have a chance to dispose of them.
Mm-hmm.
because they can feel the lagging reward in the relationship.
There's always, for me, there's always a profound sadness in these kinds of narcissism because there is no internal sense of self. All the emotional relationships, emotional supplies, everything has to come from someone else toward that person instead of having an internal sense of self that is generative, that is rewarding, and that can afford to be interested. There's this desperation underneath everything all the time to get attention, to get validation, to get, whatever it might be. And it makes people squirm, I think, a lot in their presence. And it's also very profoundly sad to encounter someone without a sufficient sense of self.
I'm thinking about the different ways that we're talking about how this can present. And M. Scott Peck said something so smart that always helps me, that I always go back to, about personality disorders. So if you're using the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or whatever it's called, the DSM, which has all the diagnoses in it, narcissistic personality disorder is classed as a personality disorder, and that's considered to be a different class of disturbance than, say, someone who's anxious or depressed. Say, if we're just using this nomenclature, which I have less and less kind of adherence to. But here's what M. Scott Peck said. He said, the personality disordered person takes too little responsibility, and the neurotic person takes too much. And to me, that's just like, that's the whole thing right there. So how do you know that you're in the presence of a narcissist? It's over time, you will see that the person just doesn't take enough responsibility for themselves. And in the case of this sort of more clingy, needy, dependent personality, that may not be immediately visible because they might in some ways take a lot of responsibility. They might be Johnny on the spot with all of their kind of outer world responsibilities or paying bills or that kind of thing. But you would feel interpersonally that they were putting a lot on you, asking you to do a lot of care, or always externalizing their problems, like placing blame on other people, or very much seeing themselves as a victim. So that's just another thought.
It's a really great clarification. I could really sit down and think about that for a long time.
Yeah, it takes you places if you think about it. It's really helpful.
But let's take a moment to characterize a different manifestation of narcissism with the alpha narcissist, which I think is more visible in a lot of ways.
Yes. So say more about that.
So the alpha narcissist also has similar childhood wounds where in some way they've been alienated from the self, and they've had to create some kind of a scaffolding, a false self in the place of it. But they find that the scaffolding inside of them is more supported through acts of control and domination. So this is, I think, more common. We might find people even gravitate to certain careers in this way. So we might find the CEO of a company has a alpha narcissistic personality structure, which allows them to be very successful at the head of a large organization where exerting a lot of control, being particularly dominating, is rewarded in that environment. People who go in for trial lawyers sometimes can have a higher percentage of narcissistic personalities because, again, they can be very successful. They can be affirmed for these qualities of domination and control.
Hard-working and talented.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, again, there's a way that a little bit of this can be adaptive, right? Because I'm thinking other careers, like surgeons, I think, are another career where you might find this proliferates more. And I got to tell you, if you're having someone cut you open, you better want that person to feel that sense of, I know what's right, you know? And I'm the final authority.
A little bit inflated of I have what it takes to cut someone open and remove an organ or do whatever is necessary.
That bravado.
The bravado, exactly. Fearless, a certain kind of fearlessness.
And it's adaptive in some environments, and it's certainly rewarded in some environments, as you're saying.
Now, the dark side of the alpha narcissist is that it's deeply rewarding to feel in control, deeply rewarding to take control, regardless of their capacity to do anything constructive with that. So an alpha narcissist could show up in your company for an interview claiming that they have all kinds of skills or abilities to want to be put in a position, and they might even gain that position, but also be something of an imposter in that environment. And I think for those of us that have had alpha narcissists in our practices or within our social circles, if we pay attention, there's a lot of imposter syndrome going on, and a lot of claims which don't have anything to back them up.
Yeah. And of course, it can be tremendously destructive. These kinds of people can be really destructive. And I mean, one of the ways that it comes into my practice, because these people are less likely, I think, to go into therapy because it would be very threatening to sort of examine. But I have people come in who are in relationships with them. And, this is this kind of classic setup where someone might need a lot of narcissistic supply. And so the intimate relationship gets set up where one person, usually the person that winds up being my patient, is having to kind of emotionally tend to this person and mirror back to them how great they are and do a lot of work kind of helping the narcissist to manage his or her internal state. But the whole relationship is about the one person being in service to the other. And there's nothing that's really relational, or it's not a two-way street.
Yes. And one of the terms that I liked, it's kind of a bit old school, is the idea of narcissistic tribute.
Oh, I haven't heard that. Say more about it.
Yeah. It's very similar to what you were saying, where the partner of the narcissist is literally offering behavior, acts of service, affirming words.
Admiration.
Admiration,
Okay.
which is a kind of tribute as if you were giving it to a king
or
a feudal lord.
In these relationships, you sort of have to keep on paying your tribute, and you will get exact, pound of flesh will be exacted if you don't, kind of thing.
So we haven't talked about one other manifestation of narcissism, which is the malignant narcissist, which has been written about somewhat recently, which is the psychopath, the person who takes this control and sense of entitlement and profound lack of empathy to really using and abusing other people in ways that are terribly harmful.
Yes, where I think the drive there in some ways can be the extinguishing of anything that threatens the narcissistic structure. And that can be very chilling to be around.
Yeah. I mean, if you sort of take it to its extreme, it looks like evil, because there's a total disregard for the other. So, and of course, lack of empathy is sort of true up and down this spectrum, really.
And that is, I think, what we're talking about is a spectrum from what's called the healthy narcissism of the child
or the adult,
or
in my estimation.
Yes, all the way to the sociopath or psychopath who has the chillingly cold-blooded disregard for the other in the service of what he perceives as his own needs.
It's almost like reptilian, I think about when thinking about that end of the spectrum, which, I think is relatively rare, luckily. That, there are these stories. I mean, I think this is a true story. Someone will have a boa constrictor, like a large boa constrictor. I think I remember hearing this story years ago about this man who had a constrictor as a pet in his apartment. And he came home one night with fried chicken, and the snake smelled the fried chicken and just very instinctively killed him. Just because, he was motivated to eat the fried chicken, and it wasn't, this is like a pet. I mean, I don't know about you, but my pet likes me, but I don't think a boa constrictor, really feels much. It just wanted the chicken. So that's what I think is sort of like what happens with a narcissist. It's like, I don't see you. I just see what you have for me.
Yes. And I've had a couple of clients in that way. And the metaphor that I would use is other people to the malignant narcissist are probably about the level of being carrots. To really sink into that to the malignant narcissist, they're walking through a grocery store and the carrots and the people have the same valuation. It
Oh
might be
my.
good to eat. It might not be good to eat. You might throw it away. You might break it in half. You might walk on it. You might ignore it. But the level of empathy that you have for a carrot might be about the way that a malignant narcissist feels about you.
It's all about utility.
Yeah,
Utility.
It's chilling. It's chilling.
Absolutely. I think that's well said. It's about utility. So occasionally, even though narcissists are resistant to coming into therapy for existential reasons, let's say, or even at the plea of their family members, fate will often bring somebody with a powerful narcissistic disorder into treatment. Perhaps it is court ordered. When I was working in the medical hospital as a medical social worker, before I went into analytic training, people would get injured, sometimes terribly injured, and I would be they'd be under my care. And I'm thinking of a particular story that happened many years ago where a young man who had been a career criminal and a very, very dangerous fellow had been at a nightclub. He and another fellow had pulled out a gun in an altercation about a young woman, and he was shot and paralyzed because of this. The healing process was very, very complicated, and he wound up being in the hospital for many weeks, which gave me the rather unusual opportunity to work with him, multiple times a week. And what I noticed is that the power of the trauma that had happened to him was able to break through what we would call narcissistic defenses and allowed him to return to a very young and fragile level of dependency and vulnerability in this appropriate setting where he was being taken care of. And without all of that false self interfering, he was able to form a bond with me and a bond with his estranged family, was able to identify his feelings, was able to care about the people around him, and begin to structure a personality based upon his valid emotions.
So what you're saying, Joseph, is making me think about something that I wanted to bring up. I've been attending to our conversation as it flows and realizing that we haven't really formulated this in Jungian terms yet. And wanting to do that at least briefly, what you're saying is, it sounds like we would say in Jung speak, he was able to connect with that sort of essential core of the personality that Jung calls the self.
Mm-hmm.
So he wasn't living on the surface anymore in this sort of false self with a little s, which is, kind of the self that's out in the world, but rather tap into the self with a capital S that Jung called the center of the personality, and the center and the circumference.
Yes, and that often the trauma is what needs to happen in order to overcome the false structures and cast us upon the mercy of the self.
And there's a regression here, and that happens often in therapy anyway, that we can kind of regress in a healthy way back to an earlier stage of development, so that in a way it's a fresh start or an opportunity to go back to a beginning. And it seems like the trauma that this patient of yours and the patient in the hospital suffered allowed him in a healthy way to regress to an early stage. He was injured, he was being taken care of, and he could let go. He was forced to let go of a lot of his defensive superstructure of what we've been calling the false self.
Yeah, so it's sort of like the healing from narcissism would require, in Jungian terms, this sort of dropping into a deeper relationship with the unconscious or something like that. Does that work for you?
Yes, I think that's true, in that depending on how that happens, it's more or less difficult for the narcissist. But I would say that deeper level of transformation of the character, not simply acquiring better negotiating skills or better adaptive skills. You see, I think a narcissist can learn to do active listening with the cleverness of their mind.
Yes.
Which actually will improve their relationships. Yes. And it's a good thing to have happen.
But it's still sort of a surface
thing.
But
the structure of the false self and this alienation from the core can still be in the place and to be compassionate. There is a deep sense of agony.
Yeah, it feels terrible.
Which often shows up as a searing feelings of envy for other people who are experiencing legitimate joy or legitimate security. So this terrible internal pain often isn't resolved until there is an almost cataclysmic internal event where there's an inversion. And that could be triggered by an outer trauma.
Event. Yeah, I just want to lift up because I think it's really good. It's alienation from the true self, really, would be one way of understanding narcissism.
So I'm thinking, to put it in a Jungian context, that narcissism is equivalent to being persona identified.
Yes.
And that we all have a persona, and we need it, sort of like the cornea of the eye, that allows us to see out and prevents grit and dust from getting in. And that we can become very identified with that surface shell social presentation level of the personality, as if that's who we are.
Yeah, I think that's one way to think about it. And there's something more structural about the narcissistic personality, So I think you could be persona identified and not be a narcissist. But there's definitely some overlap there.
And we could say that being persona identified is a narcissistic wound.
Yeah.
It's a wound to the identity for a woman, let's say, to be raised in the Deep South and told that her natural intellect must never be shown because she's always got to, submit to, the guys in the room. I mean, that's a wound to her narcissistic integrity in that way. But she may not have a narcissistic character disorder.
I'm thinking about it as the false, an analogy to the false self.
Yeah.
That if your persona becomes who you really think you are, of that I am, the star ballerina of the example given earlier, that's my sense of self is out there.
It's like what's inside.
Right. It's a persona identification.
So we thought we would probably want to also get to, how do you know that you're dealing with a narcissist? And what are some things that you can do if you're in a relationship with a narcissist, for example?
Well, to use another sort of clinical term, I think that one's own countertransference is the easiest and clearest source of information. And countertransference is just, what you feel when you are in the presence of any other person, of this is what's going on in me, how I feel. And that when we're with a narcissist, and you mentioned people coming into your practice who are living with narcissists and feel it. We feel something. We feel we want to pull away. We're deeply unhappy. We're frustrated or angry or
we're like irritable.
But there's some way that our very own sense of self will tell us something isn't right here.
So I'm thinking when you talk about countertransference and narcissism, I'm thinking about, sometimes when people cry in session, my eyes fill or I feel deeply what the other person's feeling. And sometimes someone will cry and I will feel nothing. And that's diagnostic, isn't it?
That is a terrific example, I think. That's exactly it. Of what you feel and what you don't feel.
So I have this memory of you, actually. We were we were in a meeting together somewhere, and this woman, I'll just call Jane, was going on about something, and Jane was a friend of ours, but she got teary and she was invoking some difficult, painful experience she'd had, and she was kind of dominating the room a little bit with it. And later on, I said to you, Deb, I said, God, I know Jane had this really difficult experience, but I just felt annoyed. And Deb looked at me and she said, yes, Lisa, it's true. Our dear friend Jane has a narcissistic personality structure. And I thought, oh yeah, that's right. She does. So yeah, that's exactly it.
And I think the tendency, of course, is to try harder to relate.
Yeah.
let's be a little kinder, let's be more generous, more empathic, we pour on, or people tend to pour on more relational energy and get less back.
And that's that where everything kind of winds up kind of getting a lot of attention and tending to. So what do you do if you're having a relationship with a narcissist, or you think you might be? What are some ways to do
by relationship, do you mean like dating or married to a narcissist?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Not just a colleague, but somebody that you have to, you're really seeing and are in some kind of meaningful structural association with that person, a spouse, your next door neighbor, a colleague, your supervisor, any of those things where it's not just a casual encounter.
So let's just assume that the person is not dangerous. It's not a malignant narcissist. You're not trying to escape into a safe house or something like that. But this is the kind of relationship that anybody might stumble into. The first thing I would just say is that narcissists at first blush often are extremely charismatic.
Yeah, very charming.
So I think it's easy in the first blush to find yourself feeling swept away by someone and not kind of knowing how you got there.
Sure, that's what a narcissist needs in order to be able to attract admirers, is something that attracts people, whether it's charismatic or somebody that really feels needy or someone who looks up to you, somebody who attracts your interest and energy in an unusually powerful way.
And I would say, if you're in a dynamic where you're wondering if this might be what's going on, to me, one of the key things, going back to that quote earlier, is responsibility. Does the other person take, and I'm talking about emotional responsibility. So if you get into a fight and it's a bruising fight, does the other person come back and say, I'm really sorry, and you can really feel their remorse, and they don't say, I'm sorry you felt bad, but they really take responsibility for it, and you can feel that they really have remorse, and that they're not always making everything your fault. If everything's always your fault, mostly, I think you're probably with a narcissist.
And that a relational approach, which we all tend to be very well schooled in repairing things along the relational axis, that there must be a way to talk it through or work it through or make an adaptation or take more responsibility yourself, to jump out, to sidestep that relational axis and ask yourself, what is this like for me? What is it like between me and me to be with so-and-so?
So what you're saying is focus off the other person for a minute and check in with yourself.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
I think that's really good advice.
So coming back to the question of, let's assume you recognize, I married a narcissist. This is a rough situation. Is there something that a spouse can do to help improve the situation, or is it just kind of throw the towel in?
Well, I think mostly whether you throw the towel in and, let's say, leave the relationship, or you can stay in the relationship and put more energy into the relationship with yourself of what is my life like? What do I want? What's my direction? Where's my trajectory? What gives my life meaning? Have more of a relationship with yourself rather than trying to relate to the other.
One of the things that I think happens is people in relationship with narcissists often think, well, I just have to work harder.
Yes.
I just have to work harder. I have to try harder to make this person happy. And it can make it difficult for you to know that that's actually the dynamic that you're in. And I also think kind of related to that is, and Joseph, to your question, I think it's important to recognize that there's probably nothing you can do to change the person.
To change the character of another person.
So I think, maybe Deb, you're sort of saying, well, you can say, well, this is what it is. And, this is my lot. And I have some options. But I think realistically, if you're thinking, well, if I just do X, Y, and Z, this person will change, then you're probably in for a long road.
So we're saying it in several different ways, but at least just psychologically to step out of the interpersonal context, the relational context. I have to get through to this person or make a change with this
Yeah.
person, find a different way to talk or behave, and check out of that and check into yourself and what you need, where you're going, how to be empowered, how to get there from here, and have the life that is meaningful to you.
I think that in assessing the viability of the relationship, if you recognize that you're in the situation, it has to do with understanding the severity of the narcissistic problem in the other person. Because having certain narcissistic traits or narcissistic struggles is not that uncommon.
Right.
Particularly
Yes.
if you're attracted to someone who seems powerful, or you're attracting to somebody who seems particularly assertive, it's likely they're going to have some narcissistic traits.
Yeah, we probably all do.
Yes. So remember that when we diagnose somebody with a disorder, that they have the number of traits or the magnitude of impact of the traits really impairs them, that they're really not functioning fully in the world. And that's going to change how people around them function, particularly if you're intimately involved with them. So yes, you may have a spouse who is particularly vain or are deeply selfish in certain regards, or their empathy collapses from time to time when they're under stress or they're in certain situations. And many of those kinds of narcissistic faults, if you have the strength, can be helped by taking a deep empathic interest in the person caught in that narcissistic moment. And narcissists can be disarmed by accurate, gently delivered empathic statements. And
Yes.
a tremendous amount of their anger and anxiety can very suddenly dissolve into tears.
Yeah. But I think we are sort of making a distinction between someone who has some narcissistic traits versus someone who has a deeply embedded characterological structure.
Mm-hmm.
And in which case, the second case, I would hesitate to encourage someone to try.
And at that point, perhaps even considering going into therapy for the person so that they can clarify who they are as separate from the unwell spouse might help them chart a course.
Yes.
Does that seem like a good place to leave off for today?
I think so.
Move on with the dream.
Dreams it is.
Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
This is a dream that was sent in by a listener. And as we like to remind our listeners, we're of course not going to definitively land on the interpretation of the dream, but we're going to explore it. We're going to see what's there. And obviously the only person who could really tell us is if we got this right would be the dreamer himself, and we don't have him here. But what we know is that he's a male and he's 48 years old and he's an artist. And just a little background, the dreamer says, I started dating someone when this dream arose, and I'm ambivalent about her. I was ambivalent about my relationship with my wife the whole time we were together, so I'm worried about committing to someone who I'm not absolutely sure I want to be with, even if on paper we're a good match, but my gut is saying otherwise. He said the main feelings in the dream were resolve, determination, confidence, and the realization of what's mine. And now here's the dream. My ex-wife moves back in together, and she starts belittling me like she used to when we were together, which I don't like. After she does it a few times, I determinedly tell her to move out, and then I remember that she moved into my house, not the other way around. I don't have to allow her to stay. So it seems to me that this is a good dream to sort of talk about the objective versus subjective level of the dream.
Yes. So say what those two things are, the objective and subjective level.
So in the objective level,
it's really about the other person. When it's objective, it's about the other person.
Yeah, so since he does know his wife and has a real relationship, objectively, the psyche could be speaking about the relationship with the wife in the real world.
Right. So when we have dreams that are about people that are in our lives in a daily, regular way, you know, like a spouse or something, it might actually be about that person or even just about our relationship with that person.
And particularly a part of it that was hidden from us, but the unconscious really knows about.
Yes. And the subjective level of the dream
would be what we usually assume to be the case. What is the case more often is that every person and item in the dream, every element in the dream is an aspect of our psyche.
That is being conveniently imaged with the images that person's psyche has at hand.
Yes.
Your pet dog, the neighborhood, the car you drive, your ex-wife.
So it's the inner ex-wife, the inner behavior of the ex-wife, the inner house.
Yes, the inner house.
Which then become analogous to other certain kind of psychological factors.
Yeah, and of course it can be both, right?
Yes, it can.
So, and because often the inner wife is very similar to the outer wife, you know, if you want to think about it that way. So what do we think about this dream?
Well, of course, I'm thinking about it in the context of what we were just talking about, which is levels of narcissism and whether there's an element of healthy narcissism of, you know, it's my house, I have control, and the dreamer's sense of confidence and resolve and a sense of what's mine. Whether that's healthy narcissism or something else, I don't think we can determine.
So if we think about this dream on the subjective level, we might imagine that there's a sort of inner ex-wife who is a little bit of a tyrant or a little bit oppressive. I don't know what that element might be, but there might be a way that the dreamer's own psyche tends to belittle him. I mean, we all have, you know, these inner contents. If you think about it, you probably have an inner voice. Maybe it gives you a really hard time. So perhaps the dreamer has a sort of inner ex-wife that tends to put him down all the time. And the ego is gaining the strength to say, no, you don't. You don't get to do that to me all the time.
So in that way, he may be finding a heroic stance that in terms of defeating the dragon, that the inner feminine as this ego assaulting force, you know, he's got enough power to say no.
And a lot of times people that have that sort of inner persecutor that takes a form like this, they may have had a difficult relationship with a parent who might have treated them that way, and then they internalized that. And often people with that kind of experience may, in fact, wind up with an outer person who treats them the same way the parent treated them, the same way the inner interject treats them as well.
It's familiar, and it's the template for relationship.
Yes.
This is how relationship works. You know, I'm thinking of Robert Bly and the hero's or would-be hero's task of stealing the key from under the mother's pillow.
Can you say more about the Robert Bly reference?
That it's I can't reconstruct the entire story of the tale that he basically
it's in the myth of Iron John.
Right. Yes. And that is the name of the book by Robert Bly, which is a wonderful book.
Yeah.
And it's a tale of masculine development.
Yes.
And it's been very meaningful and helpful to a number of my clients. But there's that sense of resolve of what it takes to go in and steal the key to one's own self, one's own soul, one's own selfhood from under the mother's pillow. It's a different image from slaying the dragon. And I'm thinking about this dreamer's sense of resolve and confidence.
So the story, I think it is, that there's a pond on the king's property that's drained, and this big hairy man covered with red hair is found there. And he's imprisoned in a cage, but the key to the cage is under the mother's pillow.
Yes.
And at a certain point, the young prince is playing, and Iron John kind of snatches his ball, says, I won't give it back to you until you get the key out from your mother's pillow to let this aspect of the primal masculine out of the cage. He does so, and then he's terrified about what's going to be done to him by mom and dad. And Iron John says, "It's all right. Come live with me in the forest."
Yeah, thank you for that.
Mhm.
So, I do have, that's just what came up in me. And it's an optimistic take on it. We might flip that around and say, what might be a possible more shadow side of this particular dream?
Well, before answering that, just this asking for something, claiming something, it's a sense of like entitlement, right? It's like getting in touch with healthy entitlement, maybe, like you said.
Perhaps. Now, if we go to the other side of the dream, where the dream is always right and the ego is being adjusted. So what could we imagine is happening in this 48-year-old male artist, such that the psyche might need to take him down a few pegs and he's not too happy about it? And that does happen in our dreams. It is possible that the ego is inflated, that the ego is in an unrelated position, that the ego really is a bit of a problem in that moment. And often dreams apparently are commenting on events that are 1 to 3 days prior to the dream. So if we look at, or if the client were here, we might say, what's gone on for the last 3 days? And there may have been something that this guy had done that was just a little too far, a little too highfalutin. And the psyche just decided, we're going to give you a little cuff upside the head and take you down a few pegs. And that does happen in dreams. And Jung talked about that in a dream that was very instructive for him, that he had been analyzing a woman and he dreamed that this woman was sitting atop a great throne and he was at her feet, which he wasn't terribly happy about. And when he tried to track the dream back to why would I have a dream like this, he realized, and he had been hiding it from himself, that this woman who was a peasant and not particularly educated, that Jung admitted to himself that he had felt very superior and much more important than she was. And the psyche wasn't having it. It didn't really like him having that attitude. And so it flipped it around on him in the dream world.
I'm thinking about the fact that the ex-wife moves back in. So this kind of content from the unconscious kind of comes back after having been banished or leaving or whatever. And this person's in a new relationship. And so maybe there's something there about the way he is in relationship that's now visiting him again and kind of causing trouble.
Perhaps he has a well-established feeling of antagonism with the feminine.
Yeah, maybe there's some, habitual mistrust or something. And here it is back again now that he's in another relationship. I mean, we're just sort of trying on different possibilities here, not landing on any one with any certainty.
I'm going to the word belittled. I think that's a really telling word. He doesn't say that there's conflict or some particular area of contention. It's a pretty global word. It's about character. It's not about seeing things differently. It's about who he is or who anyone is, to be belittled. And, how does that work? Someone can belittle you, but in some other respects, do you belittle yourself if you let that in? I would be very interested in talking with the dreamer about what it feels like, what it means to him. When did that happen before? What goes on here that you can be belittled? And how does this come up for you in relationship with women?
Well, there's another hit that I'm getting, because in the material that he provided us, he said, I'm ambivalent. I'm not really sure I want to be with her. Even though we're a good match on paper, my gut is saying otherwise. And that kind of gut sense sometimes can be, an image of that might be the feminine. So it's almost like he's feeling belittled by his feminine self, but he's also maybe not attending to her.
Yes. I go to two ideas come up. Is that the word belittle means to make me unimportant. So for the ex-wife to come and to make him unimportant, to make him less important. And then we were talking about narcissism a little bit. But I do wonder if that as he's starting the new relationship, that it's challenging some of his narcissistic traits, and that the psyche is coming in and trying to ring a bell about you need to be less important in order to sustain a relationship with another person. They have to have room to be important as well. So I do have the feeling that there might be something constructive, although albeit very painful, about the dream. The other thing I wanted to bring up is the idea of ambivalence in relationship and the possibility around typology. That when we think about Myers-Briggs typology, one of the 4 letters you can be either a J or a P type, which is something that the founders of Myers-Briggs, I think it was the Kiersey people, added a dimension of consideration that was beyond what Jung said, and that J-types tend to want to come to closure very quickly and very crisply, and that it makes them feel better. But P-types, which I often see among artists, are much more process-oriented, which is a typological structure. And the idea of committing to a marriage or a relationship gives them a keen sense of stopping a process and limiting themselves from all the other possibilities that could happen in the future. And for a P typology, it can take them years to decide that they will commit to anything, but certainly commit to a single person.
I'm not sure that I would arrogate so much of that simply to typology, because lots of people who have that process orientation do, in fact, stay in committed relationships. What I wanted to go back to, the idea of being belittled, and that what comes up, that the feeling of being belittled is shame. And that seems to me very important here. He feels shamed. And that may link to your comment about narcissism, because those two things go together, of the grandiosity around narcissism versus and the compensatory feeling to that is often shame. So I'm still kind of hooked on that part of the dream that says he feels belittled and what that is about for him.
Yeah, I think having kind of walked around this dream in many different ways, where I do want to come back to is it seems like there's something about the dream ego that feels beset by something, perhaps in the outer world, but certainly in the inner world.
Yes.
And it doesn't feel all bad to me that he's finding the strength to say, let's get you in your proper place here. This is my house.
And that seems like a good place for us to end for today.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.